Imagine driving home after a long day of work, your mind racing with thoughts of family, dinner, and the endless tasks waiting tomorrow. The night is quiet, the streets are calm, and nothing seems out of place until flashing red and blue lights suddenly appear in your rearview mirror. Your heart drops. You weren't speeding. You didn't run a light. You didn't do anything wrong. Yet, here you are, pulled over, your body instantly tensing up with fear. For millions of people, especially black drivers in America, this moment is not just inconvenient, it's terrifying. Too many stories have ended badly. Too many lives have been changed in an instant, all because of a routine stop. Now picture this. The driver is not just anybody. She is the first black female state attorney in the history of her state. A woman who has dedicated her life to upholding the law, protecting citizens, and demanding justice. Yet on that night, none of her titles or accomplishments mattered. To the officers who pulled her over, she was simply another black driver on the road. What happened next not only exposed the raw reality of racial profiling, but also revealed the kind of calm, strength, and courage that can leave an entire nation stunned. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a chilling reminder of the double standards still alive in America, and a moment that would go viral, sparking outrage, disbelief, and an urgent conversation about race, power, and justice. The evening had fallen heavy over the city, the kind of summer night when the air still carried a trace of the day's heat, and streetlights flickered on in long rows, spilling their dull yellow glow across the asphalt. She was driving home from work, her mind drained yet restless, replaying the many arguments, statements, and motions she had heard in court that day. Being the state attorney meant her days were rarely simple. They were filled with cases that spoke to the very heart of justice and injustice, often forcing her to carry the weight of other people's lives on her shoulders. That night, she just wanted quiet. She just wanted to get home, kick off her shoes, and breathe. But peace was not waiting for her. Not tonight. As she drove down the nearly empty road, she noticed the flash of headlights appear in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought nothing of it. Cars came and went, and in this part of the city, police cruisers weren't unusual. But then the headlights stayed closer, uncomfortably close, trailing her every turn. She gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, her instincts sharpening. Then, suddenly, the flashing red and blue lights came alive. Her chest tightened. She felt the sound of the siren more than she heard it, vibrating against her ribs. Her heart sank. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't rolled through a stop sign or missed a signal. There was no reason for this. And yet, here she was, being pulled over like so many others who looked like her. That unshakable truth settled in her mind before she even slowed the car. This wasn't about traffic laws. This was about her skin. She pulled carefully to the side of the road, her pulse quickening with every passing second. The night air outside was still, but inside the car, everything seemed charged, alive with tension. She remembered every warning she had ever given to her younger cousins and friends. Keep your hands visible. Stay calm. Answer politely. Don't make sudden movements. Advice born not from paranoia but from survival. And now, the state attorney, herself the highest-ranking prosecutor in the county, was about to follow the same rules she had urged on others. She rolled the window down halfway, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and waited. Two officers stepped out of the cruiser, their flashlights cutting sharp beams through the dark. Their steps were heavy, their postures stiff. They looked at her not as if she were a professional, not even as if she were a citizen deserving of respect. To them, she was just another black driver on the road late at night. Someone who had to be questioned, checked, controlled, license, and registration. One of them barked. No greeting, no explanation. She met his eyes briefly before reaching slowly toward her purse. I'll get them, she said calmly, her voice steady. Her heart was racing, but she would not show it. She moved deliberately, every motion exaggerated so they could see she was no threat. As she handed over her license, she finally asked, "Can you tell me why I was stopped?" There was a pause, a hesitation that said more than any words could. The officer cleared his throat. "Routine check," he muttered. Routine. The word stung. She had heard it too many times before, used like a shield to cover the real reason. Suspicion built not on evidence, but on the color of her skin. The second officer leaned forward, shining his flashlight across the interior of her car. His eyes lingered on her suit jacket folded neatly on the seat, the court documents in her briefcase. He said nothing, just kept searching, as if looking for something to justify the stop. She felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she pressed it down. Anger wouldn't help here. She knew the game too well. Anger would be twisted, used against her. Instead, she sat tall, her silence more powerful than any argument she could have given. The first officer glanced at her license again, his eyes scanning the name. Recognition flickered across his face. His posture shifted. "You're the state attorney." His voice was different now, softer, uncertain. "Yes," she replied simply. The weight of that single word hung in the air. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. The officers exchanged a glance, the bravado draining out of them. Suddenly, their confidence faltered, their authority shaken. They had pulled over the very person who oversaw the justice. It's a system in their county. The person who held the power to question their actions in a courtroom, if she chose to. It was a random stop, the first officer stammered, his earlier certainty gone. She let the silence stretch. She could see their discomfort growing, their unease betraying the truth of what had just happened. She didn't need to lecture them. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her identity, her very existence in that car, was enough to expose the injustice of the moment. Finally, the officer handed back her license. "You're free to go," he said quietly. No ticket, no warning, not even a clear reason, just an abrupt retreat. She took her license back and placed it on the passenger seat. She did not thank them. She did not look away. She met their eyes, steady and unblinking, before finally rolling up her window and pulling back onto the road. As she drove away, the anger she had kept contained began to rise again, but alongside it came something else: resolve. She knew this story was not unique. She knew countless others had faced the same humiliation, the same fear, without the shield of a title or position to protect them. But she also knew that this moment would not stay hidden. The truth had a way of rising to the surface, and when it did, the world would see what she had seen all her life. That justice, even for those who protect it, was never guaranteed. The drive home after the stop felt longer than usual, even though it was only a few miles. Her hands gripped the steering wheel firmly, and the silence inside the car was deafening. She had always known that her skin made her a target on roads like these, but to experience it so directly, even while holding one of the highest legal positions in the state, was something that cut deeper than she wanted to admit. She replayed the entire encounter in her mind, the officers' cold voices, their shifting tones when they realized who she was, the empty excuses they mumbled. It wasn't just about her. It was about the truth that no matter how high she climbed, she would never be shielded from prejudice. When she finally parked in her driveway, the weight of the night pressed on her shoulders. She sat in the car for several minutes before moving, staring at her reflection in the dark window. Her face looked calm, collected, almost detached, but she felt the storm churning beneath. She had faced ruthless criminals, argued with sharp defense attorneys, and debated with judges who questioned her every word. Yet, nothing left her feeling as raw and exposed as the flashing lights that had singled her out for no reason. She stepped inside her house, but even the comfort of familiar walls could not quiet her thoughts. She made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and let the steam rise into her face, as if it might wash away the heaviness in her chest. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, marking every minute she spent, lost in thought. The question wouldn't leave her. What if she hadn't been the state attorney? What if she had been someone else? Someone without a title? Someone without influence? The outcome might have been different, tragically different. The next morning, she arrived at her office earlier than usual. The city was just waking up. The streets busy with traffic, people moving quickly with coffee cups in hand. But she felt as though she was carrying a secret no one else could see. She greeted her staff, responded to polite smiles, but she didn't mention what had happened. Not yet. The words felt heavy, dangerous even, as if saying them out loud would make the injustice more real. Her day unfolded with the usual intensity. Files stacked high, phone calls that never seemed to end, meetings with detectives and prosecutors who looked to her for direction. Yet, underneath the professional surface, her mind kept drifting back to the flashing lights, the cold eyes, the thin excuses. She wondered if the officers had gone back to their station and bragged about pulling her over, or if they were embarrassed, their pride bruised by the exposure of their own bias. She wondered, too, how many other drivers had been stopped that same night, questioned without cause, and sent away with fear in their hearts. By afternoon, she made her decision. The incident was not something to bury. It was something to confront. She called in her most trusted aide, a young attorney who had joined her office only a year earlier, but had already shown a passion for justice that reminded her of her own younger self. Closing the door behind them, she told the story plainly, every detail, every pause, every word the officers had spoken. Her aide's eyes widened in disbelief. "They stopped you, without reason?" "Yes," she said firmly, "without reason." For a long moment, the room was silent. Then her aide asked the question she had already been turning over in her mind. "Are you going to go public with this?" The thought of it carried weight. She knew the risks. Critics would call it political, accuse her of exaggeration, twist the narrative to suit their own agendas. But she also knew silence was its own kind of betrayal to the community she represented, betrayal to those who had no platform, betrayal to every driver who would face the same flashing lights without the privilege of being recognized. That night, she sat in her living room with her laptop open, drafting a statement. She wrote slowly, carefully, choosing her words with precision. She described the stop, the officer's behavior, and the lack of explanation. She spoke not just as a victim of profiling, but as someone determined to use her position to shine a light on a truth too many ignored. She didn't lace her words with anger, but with resolve. Anger could be dismissed. Resolve could not. Before she finished, she leaned back and stared at the screen. The weight of her choice pressed against her chest. Once this story was told, it could not be untold. Once the world knew, there would be no taking it back. Yet she felt something she hadn't felt since the night before. strength, not the strength that came from her title or her office, but the strength that came from knowing she was not alone. She pressed save, closed the laptop, and whispered to herself, "It's time." Outside her window, the city glowed with lights, cars streaming down the highways, strangers going about their lives. Somewhere out there, another driver might be pulled over for no reason. Somewhere, another heart might race under the glare of red and blue. She could not stop it from happening again, but she could refuse to stay silent. She could refuse to let her story be buried in the shadows. And with that choice, a new battle had begun, not in the courtroom, but in the streets, the media, and the hearts of those who would hear what happened next. Days passed, and life in her office went on with its usual rhythm, but underneath the routine, something had shifted. She had not yet released her written statement, but the moment she had dreaded and expected arrived sooner than she thought. One morning, just as she was settling into her desk, her aide rushed into the office, phone in hand, eyes wide with urgency. "The video," she said breathlessly. "It's out. Someone got it." Her heart skipped. She reached for the phone, and there it was, grainy footage from the body camera, circulating online like wildfire. The clip began with the flashing lights, then the voices of the officers, sharp and authoritative, questioning her without reason. Then came the shift, the sudden change in their tone when her identity was revealed. The silence, the fumbling, the awkward stammers, it was all there, unedited, undeniable. She watched herself on the screen, calm and steady, refusing to be rattled. She had lived the moment, but seeing it replayed through a camera lens was different. It stripped away all excuses and left nothing but the truth. The officers' discomfort, their lack of explanation, it was impossible to hide. And the internet wasted no time responding. Comments poured in by the thousands, voices of anger, disbelief, support, and pain. Some praised her composure, calling her a role model of dignity. Others pointed to the stop as proof of what black drivers had long been saying, that no matter who you are, you can still be treated as a suspect for nothing more than the color of your skin. By noon, the story had been picked up by local news outlets. By evening, it was national. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, reporters requesting interviews, community leaders reaching out, friends and colleagues offering support. Some of the messages were not supportive. Of course, anonymous voices online accused her of making it political, of overreacting, of playing the race card. But the louder voices, the ones that mattered, came from people who recognized the weight of the moment. People who said, "That could have been me. That has been me." As she sat in her office, scrolling through the flood of reactions, she felt a strange mix of emotions. There was pride, yes pride, that her calm had resonated with so many, that she had become a symbol of grace under pressure. But there was also sorrow, deep sorrow, because she knew her experience was not unique. It was only news because of her title, her position. If she had been anyone else, the world might never have heard the story. Later that night, she turned on the television. Every channel seemed to be replaying the video, analyzing every second, every word, every pause. Commentators debated what it revealed about policing, about race, about the justice system. Activists spoke passionately about the need for change, while officials stumbled through cautious statements. Watching it unfold on screen felt surreal. She was at once the subject of the story and a spectator to it, caught between her private pain and her public role. The calls for her to speak grew louder. The public wanted her voice. They wanted to hear not just the footage, but her truth. She had planned to release her statement carefully, on her own terms, but now she realized the choice had been taken from her. Silence would no longer be seen as caution, it would be seen as avoidance. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table once again, her laptop glowing in the dim light. The statement she had written days before now felt too cautious, too measured. The world had already seen the raw footage. They didn't need polished words, they needed honesty. She began to write again, her fingers moving quickly across the keys. She wrote about the fear she had felt when the lights flashed, the unease of being questioned without cause, the moment of realization when her identity shifted the entire encounter. She wrote about what it meant not just for her, but for everyone who had faced the same treatment without the shield of power. When she finished, she read it aloud softly to herself. It wasn't perfect, but it was true. That was enough. She pressed send, releasing the statement to her communications team, who would share it with the press in the morning. Then she closed the laptop and sat back, staring at the ceiling. Her words were no longer hers alone, they belonged to the world now, to the movement that was already rising around her. The next day, crowds began to gather outside the courthouse. Some held signs demanding accountability, others simply came to show support, to stand in solidarity. As she entered the building, she saw faces filled with hope and determination. People waved to her, shouted encouragement, thanked her for speaking up. It was overwhelming, but it was also grounding. She realized that the moment had grown bigger than herself. This was no longer about one traffic stop, it was about a system that had failed too many for too long. Inside her office, she sat quietly for a moment, listening to the muffled chants of the crowd outside. Her life had changed overnight. She was no longer just the state attorney. She was now a symbol in a fight much larger than her own, and though the weight of that responsibility was heavy, she knew she could carry it. She had no choice. The video had been the spark. Now came the fire. The release of the video had shaken the city. The streets outside the courthouse were no longer just filled with the usual foot traffic of attorneys, defendants, and jurors. Now, there were crowds of protesters with signs, cameras from every major news outlet, and reporters who seemed to multiply with every passing day. The video had gone beyond a local scandal. It had become a national conversation. And with that spotlight came pressure on the police department, pressure on city officials, and pressure on her to navigate the storm with precision. Inside police headquarters, the mood was tense. The officers who had pulled her over had suddenly found themselves at the center of unwanted attention. Their names had leaked online, their faces frozen in screenshots from the body cam footage. They could not escape the glare of public anger. Yet instead of an apology, the department's first response was defensive. A press release was issued, calling the stop a standard procedure and insisting there was no evidence of bias. They labeled the incident as regrettable, but not discriminatory. The words rang hollow. For the public, the video spoke, louder than any official statement. The footage showed what people already knew in their bones, that the stop was unjustified, that the change in tone only occurred when her title was revealed, and that the phrase routine check was nothing more than a cover. Commentators on television mocked the department's language. Activists condemned their denial, and community leaders demanded accountability. The harder the department tried to downplay the incident, the more outrage swelled. City officials found themselves trapped between two forces: the police union, which fiercely defended the officers, and the community, which demanded justice. The mayor, careful and calculating, held a press conference in which he tried to strike a middle ground. He praised her professionalism, expressed concern over the stop, and promised an internal review, but the words did little to calm the fury. Too many. It sounded like another attempt to buy time, another way to avoid real change. Meanwhile, she remained steady in the public eye. She refused to attack the officers personally, though she had every right to. She knew the story was larger than them. It was about the system they represented. In interviews, she spoke carefully but firmly, emphasizing that her experience was not unique. She described the fear she felt in those first moments, and then asked the question that lingered in everyone's mind. What if she hadn't been the state attorney? Her calm strength contrasted sharply with the defensive tone of the department. The more they resisted accountability, the more credibility she gained. She became a voice people trusted, not just because of her position, but because she carried herself with dignity in the face of humiliation. Behind closed doors, however, the police union was seething. They accused her of exploiting the incident for attention, of tarnishing the reputation of hardworking officers. In private meetings, union representatives pressured city leaders to stand by the officers and warned of consequences if disciplinary action was taken. It was a familiar pattern, the system protecting itself, circling the wagons in the face of criticism, but this time something was different. The public wasn't backing down. Protesters camped outside City Hall. Civil rights organizations organized rallies. Even national figures began weighing in, demanding reform and pointing to her experience as evidence of systemic failure. What had begun as a single traffic stop had ignited a movement. She felt the weight of that movement every day. Her office was flooded with letters and emails from people sharing their own stories. Ordinary citizens who had been pulled over, searched, questioned, and dismissed without cause. Some described terrifying encounters that left them scarred. For years, others simply thanked her for speaking out, for not staying silent when she could have chosen the comfort of silence. She read every message she could, her heart heavy but strengthened by the knowledge that she was not alone. At the same time, the officers themselves became symbols of the larger issue. Their names were chanted in protests, their faces plastered on posters. Some activists demanded their resignation, while others called for deeper reforms. Mandatory bias training, body cam accountability, and independent investigations of police misconduct. The city council was forced into emergency meetings, debating how to respond to the growing unrest. For her, the hardest part was balancing her personal feelings with her professional duty. As state attorney, she was sworn to uphold the law, even when it meant working with the very police department that had failed her. She knew she could not let anger cloud her judgment. Instead, she focused on the bigger picture, how to use her platform to push for systemic change. She called for transparency in the investigation, demanded that the review be independent, and urged leaders not to hide behind political language. The pressure worked. Within weeks, the department announced that the two officers would be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. It was a small step, but it was more than most expected. The announcement was met with cheers outside City Hall, though many remained skeptical that real accountability would follow. That night, as she stood by her window, watching the distant glow of protests in the streets below, she felt the weight of history pressing down. She had not asked to become the face of this fight, but fate had chosen her. The video, the outrage, the silence of those officers, it had all come together to create a moment that could not be ignored. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. The forces against her were powerful, and they would fight to protect the status quo. But she also knew that change rarely came easily, and as the chants rose in the distance, carried by voices demanding justice, she whispered to herself the truth. She had always known this was bigger than her, and it had only just begun. Weeks turned into months, and the city never quite returned to normal. The protests became more organized, the debates more pointed, and the calls for reform louder. What had begun as a single incident, a traffic stop in the quiet of a summer evening, had grown into something much larger, something impossible to ignore. Her story had become the story of countless others. And in that collective struggle, she found both strength and responsibility. The investigation into the officers dragged on, as such investigations often did. Reports were written, reviewed, delayed, and redacted. The police department tried to buy time, hoping the storm would pass. But this time, the storm did not pass. Each delay was met with renewed demonstrations. Each excuse added fuel to the fire. The people had seen the truth on video, and no amount of bureaucratic language could erase it. She stood at the center of it all, not by choice, but by circumstance. And yet, as the months unfolded, she realized that this was precisely where she needed to be. Her role as state attorney was not just about prosecuting cases or managing her office, it was about defending the principles of justice themselves. If justice was not equal, then it was not justice at all. And if someone in her position could be treated as a suspect, then no one was safe. When the final report was released, the findings were predictably cautious. The officers were found to have exercised poor judgment, but not willful discrimination. The language was careful, designed to minimize fallout. Too many, it felt like another betrayal, another attempt to soften the truth. The community reacted with anger, but she responded differently. She stepped before the cameras calm and steady, and told the truth as plainly as she had lived it. What happened to me was not about poor judgment, she said. It was about a culture of suspicion and bias that too often targets people who look like me. And unless we acknowledge that truth, nothing will ever change. Her words resonated. They cut through the political spin and spoke directly to the heart of the matter. The protests that followed were larger than any before, but they were also more focused. Activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens began to push not just for accountability in her case, but for real reform, body cam transparency, independent oversight boards, and training programs aimed at dismantling racial bias. For the first time in a long time, the momentum seemed unstoppable. She became both a symbol and a leader in this movement. Though she never sought the spotlight, her speeches were not fiery or dramatic. They were measured, personal, and rooted in the lived reality of injustice. People listened because she was not speaking as a politician or a performer. She was speaking as someone who had lived the very experience she described. Her story gave shape to what so many others had endured in silence. In the months that followed, change began to take form. The city council voted to establish an independent civilian review board to oversee cases of police misconduct. New training programs were launched, and though some critics dismissed them as symbolic, others saw them as a necessary step forward. The officers involved in her stop quietly resigned, their careers undone not by official punishment, but by the weight of public outrage. For her, the journey had been exhausting, filled with moments of doubt and loneliness. There were nights when she lay awake, wondering if speaking out had been the right choice, if she had risked too much. But each time, she stepped outside and saw the crowds. Each time she received a letter from someone who said her courage had given them hope, she knew the answer. The risk had been worth it. One evening, months after the incident, she walked through the city streets. No cameras following her, no crowds chanting her name. She was simply another face in the city she had sworn to serve. She passed murals painted in her likeness, not as a hero, but as a reminder. Underneath her portrait were the words, "Justice must look the same for everyone." She paused, staring at the image, humbled by what it represented. It was not about her. It had never been about her. It was about the countless voices that had risen through hers, demanding to be heard. As she stood there, a young woman approached her, hesitant at first, then bold. "Thank you," she said softly. "Because of you I don't feel invisible anymore." The attorney smiled, her heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. She reached out, placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder, and replied, "This fight isn't over, but it's ours. And we're not invisible, we're unstoppable." That night, as she returned home, she finally allowed herself a moment of peace. The fight for justice would continue, long after the headlines faded, long after her story was replaced by another. But she had done her part. She had taken one moment of humiliation and turned it into a movement. She had shown the world that silence was no longer an option. And as she sat by her window, watching the city lights flicker like stars across the skyline, she knew one thing for certain. History would remember not just the stop, but what followed. It would remember the voices that rose, the changes that began, and the truth that could no longer be denied. For the first time in months, she breathed deeply, letting the weight lift from her shoulders. The road ahead was long, but it was clear. And with that, her story came to rest not as an ending, but as a beginning for everyone who would carry the torch forward. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more powerful stories and voices that need to be heard.